A Portrait of Power and Ruin, this cinematic corporate drama follows Mira Albright, the quiet, fiercely intelligent daughter of one of the world's most respected CEOs. After she is publicly humiliated by the Van Houten dynasty at an industry gala, branded Socialite's Shadow, Mira retreats into the laboratories and legal briefs of the world she has always loved: systems, contracts, and the small, stubborn truth. As she pieces together a web of regulatory evasions, unsafe practices, and moral bankruptcy that the Van Houtens have built into their $750 million luxury and infrastructure conglomerate, she must choose between fragile revenge and lasting justice. Enlisting a handful of allies, an old friend who codes for ideals rather than paychecks, a whistleblower with a conscience, and her own father's cautious counsel, Mira orchestrates a public unmasking that topples the Van Houtens in a single, dizzying afternoon. The story examines ambition and humility, the cost of truth, and how one woman's resolve can fracture an empire while revealing the hollowness inside it. The chandeliers in the St. Albans ballroom burned with a kind of slow, gilded arrogance, as if they were convinced of their own necessity. Crystal droplets caught the swish of silk and the flashbulb staccato as the city's richest came toasts deep into their champagne flutes and toasting lives more luminous than they perhaps deserved. Above the clink and the polite laughter, the Van Houten table made a separate noise, the unhurried, satisfied sound of a family convinced of its permanence. Mira Albright watched them from across the room, a glass of sparkling water cooling in her hand. She wore a dress that made no announcement. Deep green, cut simply, sleeves that traced her shoulders without apology. She was the kind of woman who would rather be noticed for what she built than how she shimmered when moving through a crowd. Tonight, however, the world expected another Mira, the familiar smiling daughter of Jonathan Albright, one of the architects of Albright Systems, a company that stitched fiber and finance into a network people trusted, but rarely saw. Her father had sent her as a courtesy to be seated with the wrong people and offer the expected nods. Mira had come for a different reason: to listen. She had never wanted the spotlight. As a child, she hid behind thick textbooks while other girls chased celebrities. As she grew, she had inherited from her father a taste for clarity. Binary conditions, contractual language, diagrams where every connection was visible. Where other hairs learned the surface of influence, Mira learned its circuits, the vulnerabilities, the redundancies, the places that could be probed and repaired. That night she listened not to gossip, but to the details people let slip when they believed they were at ease. "Look at them," said a voice at her left. It belonged to Veronica Peel, a rival heiress who wore mischief like a signature scent. Veronica's laugh was soft and practiced. The Albrights brought their ornament. "Ornament?" Mira asked without turning. She had learned to keep her face neutral when she did not intend to engage. The effect was usually enough to end a conversation. Veronica's eyes slid to the Van Houtens and then to Mira. "You know how it goes. The daughters, the charity galas, the photo opportunities, all the micro roles that keep an empire feeling human." The Van Houtens laughed in a way that made Mira's skin pull. Victor Van Houten, the patriarch, rolled a tribute around his tongue like amber. He had built Van Houten Holdings into an empire by marrying aesthete to ruthlessness. It was impeccable in public luxury hotels, transit contracts, private equity, an assemblage of comfort and clout. It was impeccable until it was not. "Introduce yourself, dear," Jonathan Albright murmured as he came to the table. He wore a smile that had become part of his public profile. Gentle, reserved, the gentler hand of a man who had been trusted with billions and used his steadiness as a kind of moral collateral. He kissed Mira's temple. "My father insists you join them in a dance." Mira stayed sitting. Her father's voice was soft, apologetic for something she had no intention of arguing over tonight. He believed in the rituals of influence. He believed in keeping old alliances intact. Mira believed in the logic of risk and the shape of consequence. She watched Victor Van Houten approach with the same detached attention she gave to the engineers at the control center when a node tripped. Observe, diagnose, decide. You must be Mira, Victor said, beaming like a man whose smile had never been returned with anything other than affirmative nods. He pronounced her name slowly, as if testing it. Your father is a good man. We've been meaning to partner on a line in the new urban project. Veronica tipped her glass in support. You'll be a natural fit with the philanthropy wing. Those gowns don't sell themselves. Amira responded the way someone who had spent her life negotiating contracts did. Truthfully, without ornament. I work with my father, she said, on technical deployments. Victor's expression underwent a tiny recalibration, from the immediate politeness to the faint annoyance of a man encountering irrelevant information. He moved on quickly. Mira felt the room coalesce back around the Van Houten's orbit. A laugh bubbled up nearby, furtive and sharp. Malcolm Van Houten, the eldest son, leaned across the table and said something audible enough to reach Mira. She probably programs the coffee machines. The mockery was small, precise, surgical, and it landed in the crowded air with the weight of a thrown stone. It was not meant to wound, it was meant to amuse. And it did. Plates shifted, a chorus of approving sounds hummed. Mira smiled then, slow and very small, because the alternative was to watch her own face betray something like anger. Inside, a different thing tightened, not the primitive thirst for revenge, but a methodical recognition. When you belittle the person who understands the architecture, you also expose a weakness, your own failure to understand the consequences. She left the table before the first course finished. Outside the ballroom, the winter night was raw and honest, sky like slate. Mira walked to the private terrace where the city spread out like a model lit carelessly. She lit a cigarette she'd not intended to smoke. It was a tiny indulgence she occasionally allowed to puncture the edges of her self-control. She inhaled, and the smoke filled the space between her ribs and the dark. You look like someone who just swallowed a wasp, a voice said. Daniel Reyes leaned against the stone balustrade, his coat flapped slightly in the wind. He had the kind of easy presence that made people say he belonged more to the city than to any family name. They had been friends since college, partners in late-night coding sprints, confidants who shared odd philosophies about systems and ethics. Daniel's talent had taken a different turn from Mira's, where she had joined her father's company to change it from inside. Daniel had drifted towards start-ups and the messy, unglamorous world of security auditing. He saw what machines wanted and what people hid. You're late, he said. You came for the spectacle, Mira replied. Did you expect the Van Houtens to purr? Daniel shrugged. I came to see you. And I watched the set fail spectacularly. They always think they're the weather. They smoked in silence until Mira's cigarette burned to ash in her palm. Then she said, Did you ever think? How long can a structure stand when its foundations are secret? Daniel's laugh was quiet. It depends on how many people know the secret and whether they have reason to tell. You always believed in the whistleblower as a narrative device, Mira said. I believe in weak points, Daniel corrected. Everyone has them. The whisper inside Mira that called her to action was not a sudden storm. It was an accumulation of observations. Papers she had read, meetings she had sat in, the peculiar patterns in Van Houten tenders she had traced months prior. Small anomalies, a reclassification here, an off-book account there, a cleverly obscured subcontract that shifted liability away from the company. Each alone was explainable. Together they began to look like scaffolding. When she told her father, Jonathan's face became a map of worn anxieties. He had always been the kind of man who preferred negotiation and accommodation to confrontation. "We don't go into war," he said. "Not for insults at a party." "It wasn't an insult," Mira said. "It was a demonstration. They were signaling who they think they can touch with impunity. They're bullying, but worse. There's something sloppy under their polish." Jonathan rubbed the bridge of his nose. "If you believe you found malpractice, we will pursue it by the book. We will marshal our compliance team. We will—" "No," Mira interrupted him softly. "We'll need more than our book. They have lawyers and ways to stall. Look at what they control: hotels, civic contracts, private infrastructures. If we go public without iron-proof evidence, they'll bury us with counterclaims." Her father regarded her, an expression at once admiring and worn. "You're asking for more than evidence. You want to break them." "I want to make sure what they built cannot harm people anymore," she said. "If they're compromising safety, if they're building systems ignore code to save money, or their transit tender corners open emergency exits to save cost, we can't let them keep doing it." Jonathan's sigh escaped like steam. "You always were a harder lover of truth than I was." Their plan could have been a legal action alone, a gradual accumulation of suits and subpoenas. But Mira felt the press of urgency not as a moral fever, but as a practical timetable. There were contracts about to settle, bonds that would mature, decisions scheduled that could, if left untouched, entrench the damage. She wanted to create a moment of pure clarity, a singular event so visible that the cost of continuing would become unignorable. This is where the whistleblower entered. A woman named Leela Park, who worked as a facility manager in one of the Van Houten hotels on the outskirts of the city. Leela had eyes like a person who had learned to keep an inventory in her head: quantities, dates, names. She had found odd maintenance orders in the system, anonymized directives that rerouted safety inspections. Leela's fiancé had been injured on a faulty scaffold months before. The investigation that followed had fitted its mechanical parts into the company's narrative, and no record had suggested wrongdoing. Leela had kept the files because grief makes people hoard evidence the way others hoard photographs. She reached out to Mira because she knew, somehow, that person mattered. Leela's voice on the first call was thin and frightened, like a candle barely lit. "They tell us to log inspections we don't do," she said. "They tell the vendors to sign off on work that never happened. They tell us to use cheaper steel and then call it the same." I kept copies. When Leela sent the documents, they were not the tidy boxes of proof Mira wanted to file immediately. They were messy spreadsheets with deliberate gaps, photographs of corroded rails labeled as Priority 2, audio notes reminding staff to optimize, safety checks, because budgets are tight. But inside the mess were patterns. Too many corners cut in the same way, the same vendor names recurring, the same handful of project managers authorizing changes without proper oversight. They built a coalition: Mira, Daniel, Leela, and a small team of independent auditors who answered to the ethics of their trade rather than to the roar of influence. They mapped the links, traced the cash flow to offshore entities with names like islands and weather phenomena, and while they did not need to know every civic loophole, they learned enough to make a single, devastatingly effective choice. They would go public through the instruments institutions could not ignore. Mira refused, categorically, to manufacture a scandal. She would not warp truth into a weapon. What she did, instead, was coordinate timing. They aggregated the evidence and forwarded it simultaneously to 3 different recipients: a respected investigative journalist whose work had toppled a mayor once, the national regulatory body that oversaw building safety and public tenders, and a consortium of investors who held Van Houten bonds. The packet was not a single plea, but multiple circuits lighting up at once. Because when the regulators received evidence of systemic falsification of safety inspections linked to a holding company that managed municipal infrastructure, they had to act. Because when an influential journalist received corroborated, time-stamped files and first-hand testimony, the story could break with authority. And because when the bondholders saw the likelihood of regulatory action and cascading liabilities, markets would respond fast, brutal, efficient. There were no midnight hacker scenes in Mira's campaign. They did not disable systems or erase servers. They collected, verified, and distributed truth. The ethics of their method was a map of restraint. Why are building a case? Mira told Daniel. If we break laws, we become the villain. If we leak without corroboration, they'll sue us into irrelevance. We win by being irrefutable. I don't know if you're a saint or a demon, Daniel said, half smiling, half afraid. The journalist, Ava Morozov, published at noon. The headlines slashed across the city like a weather front. Van hotele d'angesfecies eine vis estigat oen e parts algas wistemai sefetulo auris. The piece was surgical. Leela's testimony woven with auditors' findings and an extract of internal schedules that betrayed the mislabeling of inspections. It described in human terms the injured workers, the families, and the way a line item in a spreadsheet could become a life at risk. Within an hour, the regulators announced an inquiry and froze several pending tenders. Van Houten's stock, thinly traded but reputationally polished, took the first hit. The markets move because they are social proof in motion. The big nobody at the center of a rumor hears the echo and sells. By mid-afternoon, private equity partners, sudden, cautious, began to distance themselves. The press camped out at the Van Houten headquarters. Malcolm appeared on camera, bright and rehearsed, calling the report a malicious distortion by competitors. Victor closed his office blinds and made phone calls like a man attempting to sew together a hole in fabric with thread salvaged from the hem. What the Van Houtens did not anticipate was how the legal world would react. A contingent of municipal governments, embarrassed and alarmed, began to issue hold notices. The insurance underwriters reassessed risk categories. For Van Houten, whose contracts relied on the presumption of unassailable reliability, uncertainty was a financial disease. Bonds that had been deemed safe called their covenants into question. The company had used lines of credit against future revenue from municipal contracts. Without the backing of those contracts, their leverage evaporated. People like Victor and Malcolm had built their confidence around the idea that money confers immovability. They had never learned the mathematics of contagion. The way trust can be as fragile as glass, cracking at one point and shattering into thousands of investor decisions, supplier hedges, and bank memos. In the Van Houten boardroom, the screens told the story as if projecting the collapse of a small planet. Lines, numbers, and a ticker that did not simply go down, but fell in a punctuation of panic. Malcolm's face changed in direct proportion to the graphs. He had been brash and theatrical at the gala, a boy playing at the role of a man who could shrug off consequence. Now, as calls piled in and a creditor demanded immediate repayment against a line they mistakenly assumed steady, the performance faltered. "This is political," Victor said, because that word granted him the sense that the problem was an external force. He could negotiate. He threatened lawsuits, spun narratives, used every entanglement in his Rolodex. But a city mayor was not easily persuaded in public when photos of his scraped, poorly maintained railings lay inserted between paragraphs of from the inside emails. The law moves in layers. It needed time, but the market did not afford it. The market had taste for immediacy. And when immediate distrust is recognized, machines that feed off confidence turn away. The dramatic hour arrived with a silence that felt like a held breath. Financial terminals flashed. A syndicate of banks withdrew funding for a new development. An insurer voided an endorsement. A guarantor called in a bond. The 750 million conglomerate shrank in description, not an empire but a bundle of contracts now suspected, a brand now suspectable. An emergency conference called by the Van Houtens became a spectacle when their own counsel advised them that the safest plummeted and contrite, not the bluster they had once used to charm shareholders. Myra watched it happen from a seat in a different building, the operations hub where her father kept his counsel, a quiet place where engineers monitored grid performance and compliance teams sorted through the paperwork of a world that kept itself in order. He had been with her all day, an island of tragic calm. They watched feeds together like two people studying weather before a storm. The tape of Malcolm's dismissal, Victor's laments, the regulator's terse press release. Myra felt a small, complex ache. This was not theater. This was catastrophe for the lives tied to those contracts workers, vendors, families. The Van Houten's fall would ripple. Their hubris had exposed risk. The exposure itself was necessary, but costly. It's not revenge, Myra said when her father put a hand on her shoulder. It's accountability. Jonathan's voice was softer than she expected. The world we protect is fragile, he said. We always knew that. But you and I, our method is to repair. We tear down only when we cannot fix. They did not tear down buildings. They tore down a paper edifice, the fiction that failure could exist without consequence. And when the paper tumbled, things cracked open to reveal the truth in their damp hollows. The day did not end with the Van Houten's ruin like a final bell. It ended with the kind of legal fog that follows any seismic shift. There were lawsuits, and there were emergency hearings. There were photos of Victor standing on the steps of his headquarters, framed like a fallen king. There were murmurs of sympathy in odd pockets. People love a glamorous villain as they love a tragic hero, provided the story is well told. But the thing that looked on the news as a rapid collapse had taken years to construct. That made the differing tempos of judgment and consequence all the more brittle. In the days that followed, the press discovered other things. They found contracts where Van Houten companies had owned the right to be the sole supplier for civic concessions, privileges bought through favors that did not show up on balance sheets. They found that some of the luxury hotel renovations had been completed with low-grade materials but billed as premium. They found whistleblowers whose stories Leela's had given others the courage to tell. Each revelation deserved its own paragraph of outrage. Together, they formed the anatomy of accepted corruption, a slow erosion that fed on complacency. Malcolm's marriage imploded in public as his wife issued a statement about supporting ethical business practices. Words that read as both pang and disavowal. Victor was indicted on charges of misrepresentation and corporate fraud. The charges described a pattern of intentional concealment. The 750 million valuation the world, once tossed around in breathless introductions, dissolved into contested assets, litigation reserves, and the bleak arithmetic of creditors. Myra's nights became a strange seam of exhaustion and reflection. She slept badly because victories of this magnitude are not purely joyous. They carry the shape of what they unmake. She had not intended people to lose jobs. She had not wanted families to be shaken for reasons other than truth. Yet she knew that enabling continued practice, profitable in the short term and hazardous in the long, was not a kindness. She visited Leela once at her apartment that smelled faintly of jasmine and old detergent. Leela was quieter now, but she had found support. She had called Myra once on a night when the press had discovered something small and truly egregious, a maintenance log that showed inspections had been logged for days when no one had been on site. "We did it," Leela whispered. "We made them be seen." "You made people see what they were ignoring," Myra corrected gently. "You made them answer." Daniel walked into the same apartment and sat on the edge of the sofa the way a man listens before he speaks. He had been a steady presence, a person who counted and cross-referenced small details until the big truth emerged. He had lost clients who had preferred their secrets to remain secret. He had not regretted it. "You made them accountable because they had no other audience," he said. "But were we right to push them so fast?" Leela asked, having finally the courage to consider the human fallout. Mira thought of the Van Houten grandchildren who would now be spoken of in the cold terms of asset disposition. She thought of the workers who might lose their jobs temporarily while the city reviewed contracts. She thought of the dog, patient work of her father, who would pour his confidence into rebuilding where possible. "We pushed a situation that needed pushing," she said slowly. "We accelerated consequences that were inevitable. I suppose the question is, would you rather a slow rot that harms more people over time or a sudden break where repair is immediate and accountability clear?" Leela looked at her as if seeing the equation for the first time. When you put it that way, the moral weight of their action did not dissolve into certitude. If anything, it settled like a new thing to carry. Mira discovered a kind of grief she had not expected, a sorrow for human complicity in systems that allowed harm to ossify into normalcy. But she also felt a fierce, cold satisfaction in seeing the Van Houtens made to answer in public, in the way that truth, once unlatched, does not always return to shadow. The Van Houtens, for their part, did not become caricatures as the story circulated. They were, at base, people who had made choices and then doubled down. In a quiet scene late one evening, Mira stood at the window of the operations center and saw Victor Van Houten on the news, his voice measured and brittle. He had the look of a man coming to terms with a new vocabulary, one that included the possibility he might be judged. She felt no triumph in his face, only an odd empathy for the particular terror of being unmoored. When Victor's trial began, the city watched through a media frenzy. The courtroom was a theater less tolerant of spectacle. It demanded a different kind of truth documents, sworn witnesses, cross-examination. Leela took the stand. She answered questions with a clarity that only comes from long, rehearsed truth. Malcolm's testimony looked like a boy attempting to translate his bravado into the language of law. He stumbled. In the end, some convictions followed and some settlements were reached. Van Houten Holdings was forced to sell core assets, to restructure, to consent to oversight by independent monitors. The $750 million valuation that had been the family's boast was no longer whole. It had become a series of smaller valuations and judicially supervised auctions. The empire crumbled in the public imagination in an afternoon as the markets recalibrated. But the real collapse was more complex, a long undoing that required paperwork and patience. The cost, again, was not zero. Hundreds of employees faced uncertainty. Some lost jobs. Some lost faith in institutions they thought would protect them. Mira made a point of offering employment through her father's company to some of the displaced compliance staff. She wanted to create a circuit of repair that replaced what had been broken. Jonathan, too, insisted on supporting training programs for workers displaced by the restructuring. "We can't just expose," he said to her once. "We must help rebuild." There was a peculiar thing that happened to power after it fell. The cultural zoom. People looked closer at the people previously obscured by the glamour of money. They found other whispers and other wrongs. There was exhilaration in this, but also an ethical tangle. Did the spectacle of downfall become a sport to be watched without consequence? Mira worried about that, and sometimes she lay awake imagining the Van Houten children waking to cancellation and wondering what humanity would remain for them. In private, Mira and Daniel worked to create a new entity, a trust aimed at independent building safety, oversight, funded not by portfolios in the same way as private equity, but by a consortium of social investors and public grants. It was less showy than a headline, but more permanent. It would, they hoped, make public safety a thing difficult to privatize into oblivion. Oh, we want a body that does the tedious work so people don't have to produce whistleblowers as a condition of surviving. Daniel said. You make it sound noble, Mira said. Because someone has to, he answered simply. She thought, sometimes, of the man who had mocked her at the gala for being a daughter who didn't program anything more consequential than coffee machines. The image of Malcolm's smile at the party remained lodged in her memory like a photograph. And then the image of him in the boardroom staring at falling numbers and, more importantly, at the faces of people whom their decisions had harmed. Human fragility, she discovered, is one of the few constants in the calculus of power. Months later, in the quiet that follows public heat, Mira stood on the terrace of the same hotel where the Van Houtens once reigned. It was snowing lightly, as if the city hushed itself, cleansed. She had little appetite for society's ceremonies. She had more appetite for work. She had learned how much work truth demands. Her father had leaned into retirement a little, less publicly, still consulting and more interested in correcting than in capitalizing. You did the hard thing, he said to her once, as they watched the falling light settle on the city. You chose to make people answer. Myra thought of Leela and the other small witnesses. She thought of the ripple effects, some of them ugly, some of them necessary. I chose to make something visible, she said. I didn't plan to be executioner. Her father smiled, an expression both proud and pained. Then be the builder who follows the demolition. We cannot leave ruins unexamined. The Van Houten's empire had crumbled with a sudden, televised drama that made for easy news cycles. But the work that followed, a complex, patient reconstitution of contracts with accountability, oversight boards with teeth, and the careers of those displaced by a necessary reckoning, took longer and demanded steadier hands. Mira found the truth had a taste that was not sweet. It was a compote of iron and citrus, sharp, clean, a little bitter. It taught her that justice is rarely instantaneous, and that the righteous sentence was not victory but repair. The sense of power she had felt when the market turned was a dangerous one. She resolved not to let it become the measure of her life. Years later, at another conference, smaller, less gilded, Mira gave a talk about systems and about building oversight without the old dependencies that allowed rot to set in. She began her talk not with a flourish, but with a dedication to those who had spoken up when the risk was at its highest. From the audience, a woman whose hands had once logged fake inspections watched her with a different expression than the one she had worn that night in the ballroom years ago. She raised her hand when it came time for questions and told the room her name, Lila Park, and the story of a life altered by a choice to keep evidence. When Mira listened to Leela speak, she thought of the Van Houtens again and of their Crumble, its public theater and private wreckage. The city had learned something: an empire's veneer can hide rot, but rot cannot, indefinitely, survive daylight. The lesson was not a call to destroy, but a call to vigilant construction. Mira, who had come into the world as the daughter of a CEO and had been mocked for aspects of her life that seemed trivial, understood now what she had always been building toward, not to prove the mockers wrong, but to make a system that gave them no power to mock. In the end, the empire that once glittered at $750 million became a case study in the limits of unaccountable influence. For the Van Houtens, the fall had been humiliating and, for some, tragic. For Mira, it was an initiation into a different leadership, one that embraced the hard, patient labor of rebuilding what remained after the loudest losses. The chandelier in St. Albans still hung, gleaming and indifferent, But the light it shed struck faces now more carefully, and people began, with small gestures, to notice who had always done the work to keep them safe.